an extremely uncomfortable and haunting watch, not only because of the true nature of the actions that were committed by the individual that was being depicted on screen, but also for a number of different reasons. So with that, I thought I'd break down and explain why this show made an extremely uncomfortable watch. So let's get into it. Here is why this chilling Netflix show was so haunting. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. This show stands out on the platform in terms of the style and approach that it decided to take. We've seen reenactments of crime events in the past, but more often than not, it's intertwined with tapes of the killer or interviews with those who worked on the case. In this instance, it was a 10-part series that told the story of the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer and the reign of terror that he caused from the late 70s up until he was caught in the early 90s. I'm going to break this video down into subsections. Evan Peters' performance as Jeff. Evan Peters had the task of delivering the role of Jeffrey Dahmer, and it's safe to say that he delivered an extremely convincing performance. He was playing a character which genuinely felt like there was nothing behind the eyes but pure evil. The way in which he spoke, the awkwardness that he held, and the tone in which he would deliver his lines, which would then erupt with a moment of pure madness, was something that was so cold and sent shivers down my spine when watching. The scenes with Tony in episode 6 were some of my favourites of his, because you could sense the conflict that the character had within him on what to do, and the yearning for nobody to leave him but the somewhat care that he'd grown to develop. But the darkness that was inside of him was something that he couldn't control. What we saw in this episode for the most part was a contrast to everything that we'd come to see of the individual, hence why I also think it was slightly controversial. The harrowing scenes where we'd see him carrying out his actions all throughout the series and the darkness that was being expressed, along with the lack of association, was so convincing and believable when watching. Evan Peters played the role extremely well and added to the chilling nature of the overall series. The graphicness of the show. One thing that this show didn't do was hold back on the level of what it was prepared to show on screen. All of the torturous methods, severity of the harm caused, and the images of the victims were visible during the show, which feels like something that's going to go down one of two ways. It showed the cruelty in which Jeffrey Dahmer carried out his actions on the victims, but it was difficult to watch at points and made me feel as though I wanted to look away due to the upsetting nature of it. I feel the show intended to push the boundaries slightly and make the viewer feel uncomfortable due to the fact that it's an extremely uncomfortable topic, and it most certainly managed to achieve that, showing the story through outsiders' eyes. One thing that this show did well was that it allowed us to see the events that took place through other people's eyes other than Jeffrey. We saw it through Glenda's, Jeff's father, the families of the victims, and also Tony's. The episode titled Silenced was one that I found one of the most haunting out of them all. We would drift from different perspectives throughout the show. We followed Tony, who was deaf, and we would experience it as the viewer as well, with the sound muffling, not hearing a thing, and having to read on the paper to communicate, just like he'd done along with the encounters that he had with Jeff. It's controversial in the sense that showcasing a viewpoint from somebody who's unable to tell it is a decision to make that doesn't normally occur. And I think it can be perceived as quite disrespectful and very close to the line, if not actually crossing the line. So it was strange to see that decision being made and us witnessing it on screen. Up until then, we'd never really seen the show from the viewpoint of one of the victims, and with the previous episode finishing with Jeff taking him to his apartment, and then in the following episode going back in time and allowing us to see exactly how he got to that point, showed how he wasn't to know what was going to occur. It was extremely sad and upsetting. Seeing elements of the show from Glenda's perspective was also something that added an alternative viewpoint, in the sense that she was the neighbour that was fighting for the police to investigate prior to Jeff being caught, but they refused to listen. Then also seeing the two police officers who neglected their duty of care being reinstated and were rewarded infuriated me and showed how things weren't handled in the right way, meaning other individuals may not have been killed if this was investigated sooner, showing us that things could have been stopped so much earlier. Also seeing the victims of the families and all that they were going through, such as Saltone, where you really felt the weight of the death of his son, but also the abuse that he was facing on the phone was something that was just one small part of a number of families that were impacted by the evil actions of Jeffrey Dahmer and the ongoing suffering that was being caused. The audio. One thing about this show that stood out for me was the audio. The score and also the sound effects that they used were chosen in a way that it genuinely felt as though it went right through you, such as when there were organs being touched, a blade going through skin, and also a saw through bone. It felt like a deliberate attempt to really make you feel what we were hearing, and it did sound all too real, adding to the viewing experience in an uncomfortable way. The entirety of the first episode. The first episode of the show was something that really set the tone and mood for the entirety of the series. We saw the events that unfolded inside of Jeff's flat occur in real time, and it was one of the most intense scenes that I feel I've watched on TV for a long while. The foreshadowing of the lockjamming, the lack of certainty on what was going to happen to Tracy, had me on the edge of my seat, and I felt the tension rising. But with it actually marking the moment where Dahmer got caught, and then us seeing everything that led to this point, was an approach that I didn't expect it to take, but I felt as though it worked. It certainly felt like this show went out of its way to make us as the viewers feel as uncomfortable as possible when watching. I do feel as though this show may have crossed the line a little, in the sense that some of the families of the victims have said that they've been traumatized by the way that the events have been depicted, and I'm not surprised because it is extremely graphic, visual, audibly haunting, and as mentioned before, seeing the events through a victim's eyes who isn't able to tell their version of events does feel like it is disrespectful. It's one of the most haunting showcasing of true-life events that I've seen on screen before, and whilst I don't agree with some of the things that were done in the approach, there were certain elements that made this show original in the way that it was executed, and it lingered in my mind in more ways than I felt comfortable with. Evan Peters, along with the entirety of the cast, delivered performances that felt all too real and showcased the evil that was present within Jeffrey Dahmer. It was done like no other. It's most likely traumatized some people, and I think some others may not have been able to finish it, but maybe that was the show's intentions. To create something so dark and so haunting that showcased evil in a way like never before. The show that's being released in a few weeks that contains the tapes of Jeffrey Dahmer will be a true tell on how this depiction of events actually was, and if this show drifted for the purpose of dramatization. I'm hoping it didn't, but we'll see. It was haunting, dark, uncomfortable, upsetting, and also saddening, but it was something that I couldn't help but watch. So, there you have it, why this chilling Netflix show was so haunting. If you want to see more videos such as endings explained, theories and predictions, and character breakdowns, then click on the I button. If you want to give me a